Hello everyone, this is AlezierChess here to help you to realize your potential. And today we're going to be studying Robatsch versus Robert James Fischer. Now, many of you know who Robert James Fischer is. He won the World Championship in 1972 against Boris Spassky by a score of +4. He won two candidates matches against Bent Larson and Mark Taimanov, 6-0. He also beat Tigran Fischer-Sozin in the candidates to qualify for that World Championship match. And he won 8 U.S. championships, all 8 that he participated in, including the famous 1964 U.S. championship that he won with a perfect score of 11 out of 11. Robatsch also, though he's lesser known, was a strong player who won a gold medal in the Leipzig Olympiad of 1960, and he also contributed majorly to the theory of e4, d6, the Pearce defense, as well as pawn to g6, the modern defense, which is a favorite of Grandmaster Hikaru Nakamura. Let's get into the game. After e4, c5, the Sicilian defense, we have knight to f3, pawn to d6, pawn to d4, going for the open Sicilian, so named because after the pawn exchange and a piece takes back, we have half-open c-file for black and a half-open d-file for white, which characterizes the open Sicilian. Here we have knight to f6. This move attacks the pawn on e4. And now we have knight to c3 to develop while defending. Here we have a6 from Fischer, his beloved knight off Sicilian. And here white responds with bishop to c4, which is ironically known as the Fischer-Sozin. So Robatsch was playing one of Bobby's favorite weapons against him. And here Fischer responds with the move e6. And here a3 was played by Robatsch. Now, a3 is a very questionable decision because if the bishop simply drops back to b3, it gets off of any center fork trick ideas with knight takes e4, knight takes in d5. It also gets off of any queen to c7 ideas. And the bishop on b3 also protects the pawn on c2. And it gets off of b5 so that if b5, b4 were to come, you can't just kick the bishop and kick the knight and steal the pawn on e4. So bishop to b3 is a prophylactic move. It defends before the bishop could get attacked. But the problem with the move pawn to a3, although it prevents b5, b4 in its own way by covering the b4 square, dropping the bishop back to a2 as Robatsch intends is not the best idea because the pawn on c2 is going to be soft. And when the rook comes to the half-open c-file later, the queen is going to have to stay put, defending the pawn, and we're going to see a case where Robatsch doesn't keep that pawn defended, and Fischer's rook gets promoted to a pig on the 7th rank, which leads to the loss of the game. So here, after bishop to e7, bishop a2, Fischer castles, and Robatsch castles. Here, Fischer plays the move b5, getting ready to fianchetto his light-squared bishop. We have f4 striking in the center. We have bishop to b7 here, attacking the pawn on e4. And now pawn to f5, threatening that if you play something silly like h6, we have f takes, and knight takes e6 with a fork on the queen and the rook, which is also a discovered attack with a check from the bishop on a2 to the king on g8. So don't forget about this guy sleeping in the corner. So here Fischer shuts it down with e5. We have knight de2. And here we have knight bd7. Fischer could have also grabbed the pawn, but that leads to a lot of complications that are unnecessary. This move is also simple and strong. He develops his last minor piece and prepares to bring a rook to the c-file. Now here we have knight to g3, repositioning the knight and protecting the pawn on e4 because now it's really strong to take it because you have all of your pieces developed. And now Fischer brings the rook to the c file. This move creates a lot of problems for white. Here, white plays bishop to e3 to cover the diagonal because queen to b6 check later would force the king to the corner, and also it would gain a tempo for further operations. So here bishop to e3 develops the piece, and now Fischer plays knight to b6. Knight to b6 threatens to play d5 in some cases because the knight helps to cover that square. It also protects the d5 square from white putting a minor piece on that square or his queen. And also it threatens knight to c4, which would hit the dark squared bishop and the b2 pawn. And after the bishop moves, if the pawn on b2 is lost, then if we were to imagine that pawn not being here, the knight on c3 is destabilized. So here, Robatsch gives up the dark squared bishop in order to prevent all of that from happening. But now we have queen takes bishop check, and the king is forced to the corner. Now, a3 had lost the critical tempo in the opening, and now we can see why white is in this less advantageous position over mainline Fischer-Sozin theory. And also, like here, white's position is just not that good. It's like, what is this playing? Fischer's queen dives into e3, and already white has problems. Here, what is white going to move? What plan is he going to take? Well, Robatsch decides to play knight to d5, and knight to d5 runs into bishop takes knight. Why bishop takes knight rather than knight takes? You do have to take it because the knight is hitting your queen and hitting your bishop with check and the rook on c8. And the reason you take with the bishop is because the knight on f6 is needed to cover your king. Here, if you were to have taken with the knight, you would facilitate white being able to play f6 ideas and trying to break open your king side. So here, bishop takes knight, bishop takes, and bishop to d8. This idea is commonly seen in the Zveznikov Sicilian and was coined by Grandmaster Daniel King as the bad bishop bounce by relocating the bishop from e7 behind the pawn chain in passivity to d8 and then to b6 to put pressure on white's king on the a7 g1 diagonal. So here we have a4, bishop b6, pawn takes, and now rook to a6, putting pressure on the bishop. Now, if left to his own devices, with ideas like king h8, we would have c3. If king back to g8, just to illustrate the point, rook f3, and if queen c5 to hold on to the bishop still, pawn to b4, queen c7, and queen d3, and here white would have obtained a winning position. But Fischer's obviously not going to play two moves behind. Also, in this position, funnily enough, knight to g4 would also be perfectly well and good for black, because if rook takes queen, knight f2 check, king g1, knight takes queen, and here the bishop on b6 and the knight on d1 target the rook on e3, so that after rook takes bishop, knight takes, black has an advantageous position up in exchange here. But none of that is going to happen because Fischer is obviously not going to waste those tempes. But here, white doesn't even have that idea because of pawn to b4, and now the pawn on c2 is fixed as a weakness. And here, how's white going to activate his queen without dropping that pawn? So now knight to h5 was tried, trying to get Fischer to take the knight on h5 so that the queen can fly in and create complications, with ideas in the air of moves like rook takes b6 to bring the queen back to the queen side, followed by f6 attempting to break through to the black king. But here Fischer doesn't go for any of that. he correctly plays knight takes bishop, getting rid of that bishop on d5, which is also pinning his f pawn to his king and targeting that f7 square. So now queen g4 was played, and queen g4 is a mistake. It would have been better for white to just simply recapture and admit that he was worse here and try to regroup. Here, after rook c4, ideas like queen to d3 just run into a trade of queens, followed by rook h4, and black is doing okay here. And in this position, like, what else can you really play with white? Like, if you play f6, going after g7, g6 could be played, and after rook e1, queen f2, rook f1, queen back to e3, you don't have to take a draw, because after rook e1, repeating, queen c5, here the white queen has no way to infiltrate to the h6 square. And if something like knight to g3, rook d4, if queen c1, we would have rook f4, which blocks the queen's line of sight to h6, and black is doing well here. And the f6 pawn is going to fall, and with it, white's whole attack. So here, after knight takes bishop, we have Robatsch's intermezzo, queen g4, threatening mate in 1 before recapturing the knight. But now Fischer just plays a simple g6, and after pawn takes knight, rook takes c2, f takes, h takes. Here, black is winning. And black is not even winning because he's up a pawn. He's winning because his attack is actually stronger than white's. After knight f6 check, king g7, knight h5 check. Are we going to have a perpetual? Nope. Because of king to h6, bravely walking to the third rank of the board for black and attacking the knight on h5 with pawn takes knight. Now the king is no longer in a pin. So now knight f6, returning, rook f2, now threatens mate in 1 with rook takes, and if rook takes rook, queen e1 with mate in 2. So here, white brings his rook back from a6 to a1 to cover the back rank, and now rook to a8 is played in order to deflect the rook from the back rank, so that we can have mate in 1 again. So now queen takes b4 is played, hitting the bishop, putting pressure, and hitting the pawn on d6. And now king to g7, hitting the knight. And here, Robatsch took the pawn on d6, and Fischer played queen to e2, which threatens mate in 2 by either rook takes rook, check, rook takes and queen takes, or a queen sacrifice, with queen takes rook, rook takes and rook takes mate. So here, Robatsch played knight to e8 because the knight was also under attack. And what is he going to do here? He can't really move his rooks. Rook takes g2 is also in the air, and rook takes h2. So he tries to buy time with this knight sacrifice. Rook takes knight is played. And now rook fe1, but it runs into queen g4. And here he's forced to resign as queen takes g2 mate is threatened. What do you guys think of the game? And what should I do to improve the channel? Please like and subscribe and leave a comment down below. Now we're going to get into a hefty analysis of the game and see what both sides could have done, but also really just how Fischer could have also exploited this slow variation with the move a3. Also, in this final position, if rook g1, queen to g3 is just very, very powerful and leads to a winning continuation for black by protecting the pawn on e5. And after protecting this pawn, you can't take the queen due to rook h8 was made on the file. So rook to h8 would be prepared. And here If rook ae1, for example, bishop to d4 covers the e5 pawn again, threatens to bring the rook over to h8, and after queen a3 trying to trade queens to lessen the damage, queen f4, and here rook h8 can be threatened again, and white is totally busted. So now we're going to go back to move 11 and take it from there. Here, if Robatsch attempted pawn to e5, Fischer would have takes, takes, and bishop c5 with an attack on the knight on d4. Now if pawn takes knight, there's bishop takes knight check, king to the corner, and bishop takes on f6, and black is doing well. Here also, if bishop to e3, defending the knight on d4, then Fischer would have knight to d7 or knight f to d7. So this way the knight is saved. The pawn on e5 is now targeted. And if king to h1, getting off of the line, we have bishop takes knight, bishop takes, and now queen g5, which takes away the e3 square from the bishop and targets the e5 pawn twice, so that after queen to e2, knight c6, and black is going to pick up that pawn soon with a winning endgame. Also, in the event of queen takes bishop, we would have knight c6, queen f4, knight c takes e5, rook ad1, knight g6 hitting the queen, queen g3, and queen to e7 stepping out of the pin. And now after bishop to g5, yes, you have to step into another pin with knight to f6, but you cover yourself. The king side is very well defended, and white has no way to break through here. Now, if we were to go to move 12 here, knight takes pawn here leads to a lot of unnecessary complications, such as knight takes, bishop takes, knight g3, and d5. And after f6, sacrificing the pawn to open lines, bishop takes, knight takes, pawn takes, and if queen to d5, queen takes, bishop takes, rook a7, and here black is doing okay. But here you don't really have to go for any of this, and white does have other moves, but other moves here are also not great for white. But Fischer just elected to finish his development with knight b to d7, which is also very strong. And after knight g3, here he played rook to c8, but he could have played pawn to a5, because knight takes b5 runs into queen b6 check, and after any move, queen takes knight will win the piece. And in the event of, say, queen to d3, bringing the queen to the third rank, protecting e4, and attacking the b5 pawn, here we would have b4. And if knight to b5, for example, knight c5 hitting the queen, and after queen e2, knight takes simply wins the center pawn. And if we were to continue the line with knight takes, bishop to e3, d5 opens up the dark squared bishop, and it blocks out white's light squared bishop. And in the event of, say, pawn to c3, attacking b4 and trying to prevent black from playing pawn to d4, hitting the bishop on e3, we would have pawn takes, and bishop to a6, which pins the knight to the queen. And this knight cannot be defended by pawn to a4 because of the funny line knight takes c3, and knight can't take because bishop takes queen, and if queen to b2, knight takes a4, and black emerges 3 pawns up. So here, a5 was also an option, or an idea in the position, but rook to c8 was played, and after bishop to e3, we have the last idea or set of ideas that I wanted to show, which is that Fischer could have sacrificed the exchange here. Instead of knight to b6, which is also fine, he had rook takes knight. And in the event of pawn takes, which is the only move, we have queen to a8, and queen to a8 just puts more pressure on the pawn on e4. Now, after e4 falls, the pawns that are isolated on a3, c3, and c2, an isolated pawn, doubled isolated pawns, a pawn on f5 would be left that's artificially isolated because there's no way in heck that white is going to play pawn to g4, further exposing his king. Like here, white would effectively have 4 pawn islands and would have a completely lost position. For example, if bishop to g5, pinning the knight to the bishop on e7, rook to c8, and if rook to f3 to try to cover the pawn on c3, we could play bishop takes on e4. Remember that the knight is pinned because the bishop on e7 is hanging, and it's no problem here to give up the bishop pair. We don't need to waste time on a move like bishop to f8 because that's too slow. Here we just go in and snatch the pawn, and after knight takes, queen takes, the queen is nice and centralized. The pawn on c2 is soft. The pawn on c3 is soft. d5 is going to come, and a3 is going to be under attack. And here in the event of bishop to b3, which allows the rook to cover a3 and also covers the pawn on c2, we could play h6, hitting the bishop. If it were to swap out, we take back the knight. We also have left for a king now. a4, queen c6 covers the a6 square so that on a takes, we don't have to worry about rook a6. And also here, queen c6 gets out of the way so that the center pawns can start rolling. And in the event of rook a7 hitting the bishop on e7, we have a nice double attack with a check on the king, and we pick up the rook on a7, which would just be winning the game on the spot. So what do you guys think of this game between Robatsch and Fischer? What do you guys think of the analysis? Let me know how you enjoyed it. Have a great day. Thank you guys for watching. And remember to do better every single day. Peace.